So this guy wakes up one day, and we're going to call him Mr. X. Mr. X wakes up one day and finds something strange. A similar random post-it note left in his apartment with the following message. Basically, the post-it notes are just reminding him of some certain tasks that he had to do. Now, you might be thinking, well, that isn't exactly creepy. I mean, he could have written it and forgotten. And you have a point, but here's the thing. He did not write it. Or at least he didn't think he did. But the guy just chugs it off as, well, okay, maybe he did that in his half-awake state, and he didn't think much about it. And then the next day, he wakes up and finds a similar note, again in his apartment, this one reminding him to save his documents. And understandably, well, he starts to get a bit worried at this point. No, scratch, he starts to get really worried at this point. So the guy decides to set up a webcam too, and this webcam was connected to an app that has some sort of motion detector. But the point behind all this was, the guy wakes up the next day and finds another note with the following message: "A landlord hasn't been letting me talk to you." Now he's really freaked out, so he rushes to his webcam which he already had set up and tries to see, okay, if possibly someone has snuck in, just to see what happened during the night. And, well, strangely, there was nothing. The webcam and all the hours of footage that recorded had been erased by someone. And right here is where the weirdness of the entire thing begins to kick up a notch, because he starts to find post-it notes, not just in his apartment, but all over the doors of all the other apartments in the apartment complex where he lived. Most of them had nothing written on them whatsoever, but he recognized that they were the same post-it notes. At least they were the same leaflet from the same stack of post-it notes, where the original post-it note that had those strange messages which were written to him was. So the understandably freaked out guy jumps on Reddit and begins to ask, the questions on different forums, detailing all the creepy things that had been happening to him over this past few weeks, that all this had been going on. And of course, Reddit's been Reddit, there's always going to be skepticism and things like that. But that was until the guy made another update that took the entire thing to a whole other level of creepy. He said he had pulled up an old letter from his landlord, and shockingly, his landlord's handwriting and the handwriting of the post-it notes I had been receiving were exactly the same thing. There was no difference whatsoever. So he essentially drops this update on Reddit and says, hey, both handwritings are the same thing. It's right here where the entire thing now begins to look really, really strange, and a lot of people begin to doubt his story. Like this guy right here, who even says that it's possible that the OP, the original poster, the guy going through the entire strange experience, was either hallucinating or sleepwalking, things of that nature. Now this, you might want to toss off what this guy says, but don't, because later you'd find out that there's actually some elements of truth to that. But of course, the way a lot of others who believed him and gave him, various tips and advice, like advising him to change his lock, advising him to go to the cops, things of that nature. But the entire thing takes a completely different turn when this user named Kakalak, which is, the Dutch word for cockroach, this user named Kakalak jumps in and brings a whole other perspective to the entire crazy situation. So it tells the guy, hey, I believe you, I believe you're sincere, I believe you're not lying, but I also believe that it's possible you're experiencing some sort of mental health issue, possibly making you write this post-it notes and then essentially forget that you even wrote them in the first place. He goes on to say that he noticed some peculiar details in the OP story, especially particularly concerning the sort of room the OP slept in. It was not particularly big, and it was very narrow and poorly ventilated. And he tells him, well, is it possible that you're not getting enough ventilation? And then he also hints that on the possibility that the OP, the guy going through the entire thing, is experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning somehow. And this right here is where the entire story changes. And for those of you who don't know, carbon monoxide is essentially an odorless gas which is extremely toxic and harmful to humans. And it doesn't matter the concentration, because basically now listen, at low concentrations, carbon monoxide causes things like hallucinations, confusion, dizziness, and at higher concentrations is extremely lethal. It kills. And then the OP, whose name is Bradbury, by the way, confirms that yes, he did have a very narrow bedroom with no windows, and he did have a carbon monoxide detector lying around because Kakalak had suggested that he get one. So he, pulls it out and runs the test and finds out that indeed there were high levels of carbon monoxide in his tiny apartment. And that was how the Reddit user named Kakalak saved this other guy, Mr. X, Oh well, I already gave it away. His name is Bradbury. So that was how he saved Bradbury's life. Now, this story, goes really big, trends on the news. I think the guy gets interviewed, and then when asked about the entire thing and how he was able to come up with a hypothesis, he says, of course, a windowless apartment in Boston, of course the dude was hallucinating, but the question was why. Now, of course, there's some loose ends to this story, like it wasn't explained how on earth the landlord's handwriting and the handwriting which the OP had in the first notes he began receiving were identical.